All right, so I wanted to walk you through the process of completing the square so you can sort of hear me narrate the example once. So I've given you an example here that we're going to solve by this process. It's 6x squared minus 5x minus 4 equals 0. And the first thing you want to do when you're completing the square is to move the constant term to the other side, because completing the square is all about turning something that has an x squared and an x in it into a perfect square trinomial. The constant just sort of gets in the way visually. So I'm going to move it over to the other side just to make it a little more visually appealing. So once I've done that, completing the square only works when the x squared coefficient is 1. So I want to get rid of any x squared coefficient that's there. So I'm going to divide both sides of this, since this is an equation, by that x squared coefficient. And that would look like this once I simplify it. Now, the third step is to complete the square. Now, we talked about this in the activity that you did in the Google Doc, that when you're completing a square, the way to make this into a perfect square trinomial is to take the x coefficient, which we can call b when it's in standard form, and take half of it and square it. And when you add that to the end, it makes this into a perfect square trinomial. Well, I can't just add it to one side of an equation. I have to keep the equation balanced, so I'll add it to the other side as well. Hence, you get a step that looks like this. I'm taking half of the x coefficient, which is negative b, and I'm squaring it. And that's what I'm adding to complete the square. And I'm doing it to the other side to keep the equation balanced. So when I start simplifying this, just got to get my things to proceed, and we'll hide all this stuff. That looks like this. Because half of negative 5/6 is negative 5/12. When you square that, you get positive 25 over 144. Now, step number 4. We're going to factor the left-hand side, this perfect square trinomial. Now, the nice thing about completing the square, no matter how messy the numbers are, it's always going to factor the same way. It's always going to be half of this b coefficient that lands in this squared factor with the same sign that I had here. So if this was a plus, this would be a plus. This is a minus, this is a minus. So it doesn't matter how messy the numbers are, it always factors that way. I mean, after all, two numbers that multiply to give me 25 over 144 and add to give me negative 5/6, negative 5/12 and negative 5/12. So that's going to factor like that. Now the right-hand side is simply arithmetic. So we're going to pull a calculator out or do it by hand, whichever you prefer. I prefer doing it by hand. Getting a common denominator between these two things and adding them gives me this. So now I have one of those square root equations that we kind of talked about at the beginning of the activity. Well, not at the beginning of the activity, at the end of the activity that you did last time. So to solve that, I'm going to take the square root of both sides. And when I take the square root of something squared like this, remember that I could have a positive result that when you square it gives me a number, and I could also have a negative result when I square it that gives me the same number. So I have to put a plus or minus on the answer that I get. So here's me taking the square root, and then let me scroll down here. There's the actual square root with the plus or minus there. So the last step then is to get x by itself. So what you're going to do is just add 5/12 to both sides to isolate x. That gives you 5/12 plus or minus 11/12. And so x has two values. The one you get when you add 5/12 to both sides. Sorry, when you add 5/12 and 11/12, which gives you 16/12, simplifies down to 4/3. And the other one you get 5/12 minus 11/12, which is negative 6/12, which is negative 1/2.